Hello, everybody. Welcome to the number one podcast, fish keeping podcast on the face of the earth and the entire universe for that matter. We heard that even Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader watch this podcast in a millennia long time ago. So that's really awesome. Appreciate the support there from both the Empire and the Rebellion. Thanks for being here. Yeah, this is going to be a good one. We're just starting it off awesome, aren't we? So what are we talking about today?
We have an interesting topic that you came up with. I know how shocking that is, considering you've come up with almost all of the topics.
Oh, no.
Today we're not going to debate again. I'm not willing to sit here and get my butt kicked again today. We're going to talk about wild caught fish versus tank raised. And you probably have a lot more experience in wild caught fish than I do, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've got my opinions on it, and it's going to be fun. But we got some things to talk about before that, though. You do. You have something to talk about.
That's right. So one of the things that we're going to be doing in this podcast from time to time is what's in the news, what's been going on lately in the fish keeping hobby. And one of the things that's been happening lately, or one of the things that just happened and is about to happen, is Aquashella. And so Aquashella Chicago just occurred back in the first week of August, and it was fun. It was a little bit smaller. John, you didn't get a chance to go, unfortunately, because that's usually a fun time for us just to be able to hang out. But I will say I got a lot more sleep when there was no other people keeping me up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning having conversations. But that was still a downside. But anyway, yeah, Aquashella Chicago happened. If you were there, would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Did you enjoy it? What did you think? It was a little bit different. So, John, like I said, I know you weren't there, but there were a lot more people selling stuff. And for a lot of people, that's an advantage because a lot of people go there with money to burn and they want to buy said stuff. But I would say of any Aquashella, and I've been to every single one, I've never missed a single one since they started back in, I think it was like October of 2018. Went to the first one in Chicago, been to every one, and this was by far the one that had the most vendors selling fish and plants and rocks and wood and invertebrates, you name it. It was there. There was still a nice showing of, vendors just showing off their new products and everything, but it had a different feel to it. It's a little bit smaller. And so I think for a lot of people who are used to going to Aquashellas, they're like, wow, this one's a little bit more condensed. The aqua crib wasn't there, that part that you walk through where there's like laser shows and fog and all of that kind of stuff. So that's been in the news recently. And of course, we have another one coming up, Daytona Beach. That is the first weekend in November. And I don't know size-wise if it's going to be similar to last year, if it's going to be, I don't know what the size is going to be like. It was pretty well attended last year. If you've never been to one, highly recommend. If you're in the area, you're able to go, or if you just feel like, I don't know, it's November, you live in an area where it's like, it's cold, it's dreary, I want to go someplace warm. It's Daytona Beach. So it's on the beach and it'll be nice and warm, probably in the 70s or 80s there. So it might be worth checking out.
Yeah, Aquashella, I hate to say it this way, but it makes me sad now. It's not Aquashella's fault. It's just that used to be such a staple in Lisa and I's existence, because there's people, I consider you a very good friend, even though you kicked my butt last week so bad. And it was really the only time, I don't know, have we ever seen each other not at an event like that? There was the Aquatic Experience a couple times, and then there was Aquashellas. So I look at it as a great time to hang out with friends like you and other people in the industry, and then also to meet the people that we only see their names in the comment section, and to meet all of these people is amazing. And to have missed out on that twice this year it's been a drag, and I miss that for sure. Aquashellas are a lot of fun, even though, like you said, things are changing and slowing down. I think that might be a sign of the times. This might be kind of I don't mean to sound doom and gloom here, but like a kind of a downturn in our industry a little bit. The aquarium industry goes in waves. And you can't predict it. You don't know it's coming, but sometimes there's a huge wave and we're all living life. I hate to say it this way, but the pandemic, when everybody was locked in their homes, was certainly one. The show Tanked made aquariums very popular. Whenever there's a Disney movie about a little clownfish, the hobby sees an upturn. And I think that aquashellas were kind of riding that for quite a while, and it was the thing. But now that things have kind of settled back down to normal, maybe there aren't as many people just losing their minds with excitement to go, which is why things are changing. And as quickly as they went like that, they can turn around and become the absolute happening thing again. I hope that's the case. And I hope that Lisa and I can go, because it's been a crazy year for us and we haven't been able to go to them. But nonetheless, aquashellas are a lot of fun,
Yep.
even if it is just hanging out with you till 2 a.m. and
Right.
just shooting the breeze. That's kind of the highlight of the weekends for me, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's been in the news lately. That's the things that have been happening. We have a great topic today, and that is wild caught versus tank raised fish. And I know a lot of you have probably got opinions, and we would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Do you support wild caught fish? Is it the worst thing that's ever happened? I did a video on the subject probably 3 or 4 years ago, and that video really stemmed from another video that I did, and that was a fish room tour of somebody who basically brings in wild caught fish, a lot of plecos, a lot of fish from South America, quarantines them, gets them, makes sure they're nice and healthy, and then sells them. And I remember hearing a lot of people in that video, I remember seeing a lot of comments in that video saying, oh my gosh, wild caught fish, we're destroying the environment, we're taking all these fish, and it's going to have an impact on our ecosystems, and it's a horrible thing. And so I did a video on that subject just because there are a lot of really strong opinions. Now, from the start, John, I'm just curious, wild caught fish, what are your thoughts?
Well, wow. Okay, you want me to just go ahead and get controversial right in the beginning of the episode here. I'm not a fan. Um, it's just my personal opinion. I'm not a guy that's going to stand on a picket line and campaign against them or protest them. I'm not going to criticize somebody who's into wild caught fish. If that's your thing, good for you. Me, I am not a fan. I understand all the arguments. When they're in the wild, they have a vast amount of predators that could come along and take them, and they may not experience that in a home aquarium. Although we hear about fish killing other fish in aquariums every single day, whether they're tank raised or not. But I understand that. I understand their life expectancy is longer in an aquarium. I personally, though, am just not a fan of pulling something from its natural environment and confining it to a small box.
Yep.
Tank raised fish, they don't know any different. Tank raised fish have always been in a tank. That's always how they've had it. They don't know any different. It's kind of like a cat that's been, raised in a home, and they've been a domesticated cat their whole life. They don't know what it's like to be outside, and so that's what I prefer. I have had wild caught fish in the past. When I was younger, I was the appeal was the rarity of it, and you could tell people, hey, this is a wild caught compressiceps from Lake Tanganyika, and it was like, I don't know, it was a talking point. It was something interesting to talk about. But the more I've grown and thought about it, it's just like, yeah, that's not really for me. I don't want to be a downer, because again, I'm not trying to shut down the wild caught industry, but I'm not a fan of that. And there is, of course, the effect that it has on ecosystems and stuff like that too. That's a whole other topic. But just the pure morality of it, taking an animal that has access to, the biggest lake in the world and putting them in a little 50-gallon box just seems wrong to me.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I think it would probably be a good idea too. Project Piaba is an organization, a nonprofit organization who has done a ton of work when it comes to trying to establish sustainably caught, wild caught fish in the aquarium hobby. John, if you think about it, if you can put their link website in the description below, because if people are interested in an organization that really focuses on this, their website is invaluable. A long time ago, when we were at the Aquatic Experience back in gosh, what would that have been? 2018, maybe, whatever the last one was.
19.
Yeah, 19. So Project Piaba was there, and I had an opportunity to sit down. I did an interview. There's a Project Piaba video somewhere on Primetime Aquatics, and I got an opportunity to sit down with her, with someone from Project Piaba, and we talked a lot about wild caught fish. And she brought up a lot of interesting points, and I tend to agree with you. So if you were to look in my fish room right now, I have, to my knowledge, zero. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have some wild caught fish, but not specifically because they're wild caught and there's some value that I ascribe to them. So we have to be really careful, I think, first off, because there are some fish in the hobby. I'm thinking things like clown loaches and some other fish where they're taking them from the wild. So there are some fish where you cannot breed them in captivity. I'm thinking about my bitterlings that I have. So that's why I said, whoa, hold on, I got to be careful here. Like the volcano bitterlings, the whitefin bitterlings. It's a really, really complicated mating process that they go through where they're fry. They migrate down into brackish water, then they come back up a river, and then so you cannot mimic that in an aquarium. They're using live clams for their eggs to hatch out, and it's like, yeah, good luck. You're probably not going to breed those in the home aquarium. And so if they are in your fish tank, I think a lot of people may not appreciate that you might very well have some wild caught fish in your aquarium right now as we speak, even though they weren't labeled that way. I'm again thinking some of the loaches, your bitterlings. There are fish out there, but outside of that, all right. So do I think, first of all, that we can have a freshwater aquarium hobby without any wild caught fish? Well, maybe, but you're going to be eliminating quite a few popular fish. So there's a possibility there. All right. So some of it's unavoidable if you like some of your loaches and some of your other types of fish. The other interesting aspect of that, I think the reason why a lot of people do it, like the advantage might be, and I'm thinking cichlid breeders in particular, and I'm thinking even in my own situation here, I've got this Neolamprologus multifasciatus 50-gallon lowboy, the multi-shell dwellers. I've had these fish up and running in that tank for, I don't know, maybe 7 years now, and they've been breeding nonstop in that tank for 7 years. And you could make an argument whether it is multis or any other type of cichlid. Sometimes it's nice to reinfuse genetics from an outside source, because even if I get multis from another place in Chicagoland, there's a really good likelihood, really strong probability that a lot of the shell dwellers that are in my area might have all come from local breeders, and we might all be just swapping these fish back and forth, and the genetics might not be all that dissimilar. Where if you bring in a dozen multis, throw them in that, quarantine them, of course, throw them in that tank, maybe you're mixing some genetics in and reducing the likelihood that you could have some fish that wind up with genetic abnormalities that are now almost impossible to remove from your breeding stock.
Yeah, and that's one of those scenarios where I'm going to be a total hypocrite. I mean, I don't. If somebody's bringing in wild caught F1 fish and they're breeding them, and that's why they bring them in. This is the strain of fish in its purest state, and that's what we're going. I actually look at that as a good thing, because it is starting from the beginning. There's no conflict there. I'm not necessarily against that, but it's the guy or the gal that pulls that 12-inch Oscar out of the Amazon and brings it in and puts it in a 125-gallon tank. That's kind of where I was going with not feeling good about it. I mean, I do think that there is a reason to pull wild caught fish, and like you said, some of them, that's the only way they're going to be in the hobby is you bring in the wild caught ones. So like I said, I won't be campaigning against that anytime soon, but just bringing it in just to be able to show to your friends that fish came from the wild. Me personally, I don't know what there is to brag about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And even when I import a lot of fish, we just got an order in thousands of fish actually, because we're entering the swap seasons here coming up in September. And I have options. When I look at the list, there are options for particular fish. Do you want tank raised or wild caught? 100% of the time I'm picking tank raised, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And so one is the environmental impact. I'm not crazy about pulling fish out of the wild that can be bred in a tank. That to me, there is a disconnect, just like what you were saying. But I have other issues with wild caught fish, particularly for my situation, and that is wild caught fish very well may be bringing in some type of wild caught disease that they are immune to, but they wind up in your aquariums, and the fish that you have never been exposed to maybe certain types of viruses, bacteria, fungal infections, where the wild caughts are like, yeah, I'm a carrier. That fish is a carrier of that particular pathogen, but not impacted by it. They wind up in your aquarium, and all of a sudden, you're like, all of my existing fish that I had in that tank, even after quarantine, are messed up because a fish can be a carrier. And that's the one thing about quarantine, even after 4 weeks, if a fish can carry a parasite and not really be impacted by it, they can go through a 4 week quarantine period, wind up in your regular tanks and be like, ooh, wow, okay, something's going on here with the fish that I had. This literally is happening to me right now as we speak. I have a quarantine tank with some green neons and some chili rad spores. They were fine. I forgot to have Eli move those fish to another quarantine tank because technically they were out of quarantine. I could have combined them with like fish. I just threw in some pygmy cories. Threw the pygmy cories in the tank. Now those were not wild caught, but it's the concept still applies. Threw in the pygmy cories. Guess what happened? Pygmy cories are fine. Guess who's got white spots? The green neons and the chilies covered. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. So now I'm treating that tank because the existing fish caught something from the new inhabitants. The new inhabitants are great. They're swimming around. They're eating like, hey, man, this is the best life ever. Thanks for feeding me. Haven't been fed in a while. And all the existing fish that were in there, not a lot. There's like 20 of them in there. And I was like, okay, now they're all messed up. So wild caught fish, there's an opportunity to introduce disease into your tanks that your fish have never seen before.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's my number one thing that I would bring up. I don't even want to bring up yet. It would not be that. So that one surprises me a bit. I mean, it's not news to me. I knew that was an issue, but to know that you're going through that right now is, for lack of a better word, wild. that's happening. But yeah, I mean, you have no idea what these fish have been exposed to, and the reality is, if they're in the wild, they've been exposed to a lot of things that we in the aquarium hobby have never even heard of, and that's pretty scary. So yeah, avoid that at all costs, because you have a good situation there where you've got a closed system where you're not going to be transmitting from one tank to the next, but all it takes is dipping the net in there and then putting it in another one, or a bucket, whatever it is. It's so easy to contaminate everything in a fish room. I personally know somebody that had that happen, and it was a devastation that is not even fathomable how much money he lost in that situation. A professional in this industry, that's just too much risk for me. You have no way. It's not like there's a test that you can do that absolutely clears your fish of any and all problems that they could have. That just doesn't exist. So you're taking a big risk, and that's not one I'm willing to take.
Yep. The other thing to consider too is with wild caught fish, we give out information. I do all these species profiles. Here's the water parameters. Here's where they're going to do well. That's assuming that the vast majority of the fish that are being produced are probably tank raised, where they're more tolerant of a wider range of water parameters. But if you don't believe me, bring in or order some wild caught cories, wild caught plecos, ultimate angels, or any other angel for that matter, especially discus. Oh my gosh. Yeah, exactly. Put them in your tank and watch them just slowly, or sometimes very quickly, just absolutely disintegrate. I've done that again, where I've brought fish in. Clearly, they were in a pH that was much lower, water hardness that was less. And for me, when I bring the fish in, they're going in Chicago water. This is where I'm selling the fish. They have to acclimate. And there's every once in a while, I'll get fish, and you can tell almost immediately. You put the fish in, and they're doing somersaults. You're like, oh crap! This is the pH. Usually, it's the pH is off, and that can be. I've gotten really good at making sure I don't do that. But with wild caught fish, you do have to do a better job of managing the water parameters that they were in. I remember, I don't know, Ted Judy?
Oh yeah.
So Ted Judy back in the day used to do a lot of YouTube videos, and he's a really, really smart guy. And one of the things that he used to do is he would go down to South America from time to time and he would do some exploring there. And he was measuring water parameters of fish that were being caught. So water parameters based on where the fish were. And then he was measuring the water parameters based on where the fish were being bagged in South America. And then he was measuring the water parameters once the bag got to his home. It was amazing because what was happening is I think they were angelfish. I don't remember. This video is very, very old, so don't quote me on this. But the trend was something like, oh, in nature, the pH was right around a 6, and it was very soft water. He was in South America, one of the rivers. I have no idea what the river was, but low single digits in terms of GH and KH. What got interesting is when he measured the water of the place where they were actually doing the bagging, the pH was actually less and the GH and KH was even lower. By the time the bag got to his house, the pH was in the upper 4s, and there was basically nothing in that bag, like nothing buffering the water at all. So you're taking this fish, and now we're thinking, okay, if I do the right thing, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go back to nature, and nature was like a 6.3 or 6.5 or whatever. And my GH and KH were like 4 or 5 degrees. I'm going to mimic that in these fish go, not realizing they had just spent a week, maybe more, in a bag that was actually a pH that was approaching upper 4s with almost no GH or KH. And then you even throw them in that water that's 6.2, gone, dead,
Yep.
it's over. So now you think about just what I do, what a lot of people do. Okay, I'm going to get these fish. They're wild caught. I order them off the internet. It's going to be awesome. But here I've got moderately hard water with my GH and KH at 7 to 10 degrees, or in some cases hard water, and my pH is closer to 7, 7.5. It's over. Good luck. I mean, those fish are usually going to experience so much stress. If they don't die immediately, their immune system is compromised. They're certainly not going to breathe in that water, but you're going to have a really big problem.
Yeah, and I think that's where, even though, again, Ted Judy, and let me clarify, because I said I spent the night in his house. It was nothing weird. I was there visiting custom aquariums. We actually went to Aquashella in Chicago 2019. And then Ted lives like 3 hours from Chicago. Used to. Actually, he's retired and he moved to, it doesn't matter. He moved south somewhere. But stayed at Ted's house, and then we went to the custom aquariums facility the day after. And I didn't even get to see his fish room because we got there at like 2 a.m. and then left at like 7 a.m. the next morning. So anyway, I didn't want that to sound weird that I said I spent the night at his house. But, I had a long conversation, in fact, did a video about it. And I think you and I are going to do a episode in the future, drip acclimation versus plop and drop. I think that's where the whole concept of drip acclimation came from, is to slowly introduce the fish to the water that they're used to because of the effects that it's had in the bag. But I could make the argument, and Ted would make the argument, that drip acclimation is still even worse than plop and drop. But I think that's probably where the whole concept, and the saltwater world, I mean, we drip acclimate saltwater fish. I think that's where it came from, is trying to make that transition from the bag to the aquarium not as drastic on the fish. But we'll get into that in much more detail in that episode, whenever it is that we do that. It's on the list at some point.
It is on the list. So again, when you're thinking about wild caught fish, there are some drawbacks. You've got fish that, as John, you mentioned early on, you're taking them from the wild, you're putting them in a glass box. So there's an ethical concern there. 2, you have water parameter issues that you're going to have to match much more closely, and the likelihood that they acclimate to water that is significantly different than their own is going to be greatly reduced compared to if you buy tank-raised fish that were born in water closer to your own water parameters. The other thing is cost. We didn't even talk about that yet, right? I mean, no, and that's one of the other reasons why I look at these fish. I'm like, oh my gosh, so I've got all these drawbacks, and you're going to typically spend a lot more money on wild caught fish relative to the tank raised fish. And when you had your pet store, I'm sure that you saw that quite a bit.
Yeah, we did not carry wild fish. It was not even an option. That was a no.
Right. I mean, how do you justify? It's like, okay, I've got these two fish. They're Eureka Reds, they're Lemon Jakes, and they both look really similar. Here's your wild caught for 50% more than your tank raised fish. And for most customers, again, unless they want to reinfuse some of those genes, which is a totally understandable thing, it's like, man, you know what? I don't know if I want to. Here's a fish for $30 and this one's almost 50. Let's go ahead and buy the $30 fish because it looks just as nice, right? And of course, then you've got the problem of maybe reintroducing or introducing disease into a tank that your fish have never seen before. And oh, by the way, your quarantine tank might be a mess after that, because now you're like, okay, I just destroyed my display tank. There was something those fish carried. They're fine, but my quarantine tank's probably got that same thing. So I got to break that thing down and basically reset it up again. But all that being said, now, can you think of any other disadvantages?
Well, when I said earlier that my number one thing, it has to do with exactly what you're talking about now. It's the water parameters issue. I mean, when I think wild caught fish have caused a lot of the problems that people run into, because a lot of times you'll have a fish keeper that'll look at a species profile or perhaps read an article from a tropical fish keeping magazine or something like that and see that, discus are, you need it super soft, a 6.0 pH, but that's what they're in the wild. And then people try to match that because they think that's the right thing to do. But the problem is unless they're labeled wild caught, the vast majority of discus that are available, and this goes for all fish, but particularly with discus, they're all going to be tank raised. And so they're not used to anything even close to the parameters that they would have had if they were in the wild. They have always been in, domestic water here in the United States or wherever it was, Germany, wherever they were bred. That's what they're used to. So if you try to mimic what they would have in the wild, you're killing those fish. You're doing the reverse of what we were talking about before. And so that is a problem. But also, I personally believe that, forget about all of the disease potential and all that, which is definitely there. I think tank raised fish being raised in water that is close, if not identical, to the water that you have at your house, that's all the fish have ever known. That's all the fish's parents have ever known, is that tap water. You're much more likely to have success and an easier experience housing that fish than if you were to go wild caught. So the water parameter issue is the number one issue for me. It's so vastly different, and it gets complicated when you start talking about wild caught. The people that chase parameters around and stuff like that, they're trying to match wild. And if you're housing wild fish, that makes sense. But that's too much of a hassle. You're not going to be as likely to have to deal with that if you're dealing with all tank raised fish.
Yeah, and that is an outstanding point. I'm glad you brought that up, because it creates so much confusion. When I do the species profiles, I talk about, okay, well, here's where they're found in nature, but here is a range, a pH range, a hardness range. And oh my gosh, I cannot tell you how many times I get comments on videos where they will see a tank. And probably the number one comment stemmed from, I used to have a 4-foot, 150-gallon tank. And in that tank, I had our all-star Geophagus altifrons. And in that same tank, I had a frontosa. And they were buddies. They hung out their entire lives together. They're two fish that really aren't all that aggressive. And people would go crazy and talk about, you've got those two fish in the same tank. They require different water parameters. You're the worst fish keeper ever. So one, those fish had been in that same tank for many, many years. Two, and I explained exactly what you just said. Look around my fish room. At the time, I had 80 aquariums, and right now we've got 45. Every single tank that you see has the pretty much exact same water parameters. I don't change the water parameters for that Geophagus tank behind me if you're watching on YouTube. I don't change that to go lower in pH. And the Lake Tanganyika tank I have right here, I don't have to up that. It's all the same. And so in my videos, I talk about, okay, we're running a pH close to 8. We have a GH and KH of around 10 degrees. Every single fish in our fish room experiences those exact same water parameters. Now, those same people would have said nothing if that frontosa was in a Lake Tanganyika tank right next to the Geophagus tank. So
So
the
true.
fact that they were in the same water triggered a lot of people. But if I had had them in separate tanks, nobody would have ever thought anything about it. And the question I have for a lot of you listening is, how many of you go through the trouble, if you've got multiple tanks, of changing the water parameters for every single tank that you have to theoretically optimize the natural conditions of the fish that you keep? When in fact, most of the time, the way that 99% of fish keepers keep fish, it's impossible to do anyway, because you've got fish from multiple parts of the world in the
Right.
same tank. It's like, hey, I've got these tetras from South America. I've got some guppies that were brought in from Indo. I have some cory cats from South America, but I also really like mollies. And it's like, those are wildly different water parameters when you consider what they require in nature. But if you've got something where all fish can accept that range and thrive and be happy and live a long, happy life, that's the most important thing. And so usually I tell people, if you're really thinking about how to keep fish together, one, obviously, is aggression. You don't want fish that are going to bully or eat other fish. And two, diet. The reason why
Sure.
the frontosa and the geophagus got along so well is they basically require the same diet. They're not mbuna. They're not algae eating, mostly plant matter fish. They like to eat the same food. So it worked out great. Their personalities got along well. They were roughly the same size, and it was fine. But I love the fact that you brought that up about you could do reverse, in a sense, reverse damage by trying to mimic nature when they've never actually been in nature.
Yeah, because the point is, first of all, I've got two things. One is you had an even more extreme example of this when I was in your fish room, and that would be the Oscar with peacocks, and the
Uh,
peacocks were breeding. And guess
yeah.
what? The big, full grown, nasty Oscars were not eating the fry from those peacocks. That blew my mind.
Mhm.
But the fact that you have these Lake Malawi fish in with these Amazonian fish, how could they possibly commingle when their water parameters are so vastly different? It's because they've both been in the same water since they were born. And that was the second point. These farms, at least in the United States, I've been to a couple of farms, as I'm sure you have, they're not drastically changing their water parameters. They've got their water that comes out of their tap or out of their well. Usually it's a well, because
Yeah.
it'd be $80,000 a month for their water bills. But this is water that's coming from the ground, and that's what they use. And all the Tanganyikan fish, all the Malawian fish, the Victorians, even some South Americans, the farm that I was at was breeding Dovi. They're all breeding in the same water. And so that's
Yeah.
not just the fish that you're buying, but those fish's parents and probably the parents of them. And the thing is, they're bringing in wild caught fish, which they
Mhm.
use as their breeders, and it takes them some time because they have to adapt to the water here. Because again, they get a shipment in of wild caught frontosas and Pimpway blues that they want to breed. They're not going to alter the water to suit those fish. They're going to put them in the water that is at their farm. They're going to let them adapt, and it might take them several months or even a year before they breed. But then once they breed, those fry, that's all they've ever known, is those water parameters that they're in right there. And you'd be actually having ill effects on them if you tried to match Lake Tanganyikan water.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you've been to those farms in Florida. That's rock hard water. I mean,
Oh
you
yeah.
can't really find in the United States, when you're talking about water hardness, Florida is way up there. When I did my video on water hardness, I actually put up a map of the entire United States and, generally speaking, what the water hardness is in each region. And oh my gosh, when you're in that area there, it is really hard water. Now they will lower the hardness when they're breeding like tetras and stuff, but then they bring it back up when they have to store the
Right.
fish, because they're not going to store all these fish in RO. That would be, it's just, you're not doing that in a major scale. So yeah, that's not happening. The other thing to consider, and this was something that Project Piaba brought up that I had not considered. So going back to the environmental aspect, right? Because that was where we started. One of the things that they do is they teach people who live in those areas how to make a living off of collecting wild caught fish. And the reason they do this is they have found it's actually more environmentally damaging if you have people that are exploiting their environment for money and not being educated on how to do that sustainably. And so what they've done is said, okay, here were some people who are slash and burn farming. Slash and burn farming means you go to the rainforest. In the rainforest in South America, most of the nutrients are actually in the trees. It's not in the soil. So what people do when they slash and burn is they chop down all the trees to get to the soil, and then they start growing crops. The problem is because most of the nutrients are up in the trees and not in the soil, the crops only last a few years before the soil is completely depleted, and now nothing grows. So it's incredibly environmentally damaging, but it's one of the things that a lot of people do to get by. So what they did, Project Piaba, is they started teaching people how to, well, one, farm sustainably, not farm sustainably, but more importantly, they switched them from farming into collecting wild caught fish, but doing it in a sustainable way where they're not depleting the stocks of their natural environment to a point where they can't recover. That solved the some of the slash and burn farming that's going on there, which is saving the environment. But here's the crazy thing. When they looked at what was happening in some of these areas, so you've got the rainy season there, and you'd have a bunch of water, you'd have all these rivers form and all these bypasses, and then as it starts to dry up, the rivers, they slow down, but then all these bypasses, they get cut off, and you're left with all these large puddles. That's what they're exploiting. So there's a lot of these wild caught fish, these cardinal tetras, neons, black neons, these things that you would think, oh my gosh, you're just scooping these out the tens of thousands, which they do, but they're actually finding them in these puddles that would eventually dry up and all the fish would die anyway.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing. I'm going off in another direction here, but it certainly applies. Is with the wild caught or with tank raised fish. Sometimes, if you want to breed those, you do need to mimic the what. And I'm sorry for bringing this up now. This is just how my brain works. Is it has nothing to do with what you were just talking about, but. There are people that will have like fish that will not breed in the water that we have out of our tap. And in order to get them to breed, and again, because of the way my brain works, I can't think of any off the top of my head. You're the professor. I'm sure you know. There's some fish that in order to get them to breed, you're going to have to mimic those levels in the wild. But most of us, we just want to keep fish. We're not as like dead set on breeding them, but that is an element of the hobby that most of us do experience at one point or another. And you might have fish that you've been trying to get them to do it forever and they just won't do it, and it's because they're not going to do it in the tap water that we have, which is goes back to what you were saying at the farms. They may adjust it for their breeders, but once they spawn, they put them into grow out tanks and vats and stuff like that are the same water as everybody else. So when you get them, they're used to the same water that you're used to. Sorry to go completely off the rails there, but
no, that's not, because a lot of the tetras, a lot of the barbs, in order to breed those fish, for some of them you have to lower the water level in your tank. So again, you're mimicking these different seasons. Some of them you have to up the temperatures. Some of them you need to add more RO water, because that is going to mimic like the rainy season, where actually the water hardness will change a little bit, because the more rain you have, you're diluting the water a little bit. So temperature changes, water hardness changes, which then lowers the pH, the water level itself. The day-night cycle may change a little bit, not so much in the equatorial regions, because that doesn't change, but for some fish, it will matter. So yeah, when you're getting wild caught fish and trying to get them to breed, it can be a little bit of a challenge, because you are going to have to get closer, not only in water parameters, but in the overall ecosystem. It's going to have to be more similar.
Yeah. And again, I think that when I think about wild caught fish, the very first fish that pops into my head is discus, because for a very long time, before either of us were even born, fish were so close, the discus were so close to wild caught, that you did have to adjust the water parameters. And that's why they were labeled as fish that were so difficult to keep, because you had to chase parameters all over the place in order to keep them. But now I'm not going to call discus easy, because it hurts your pocketbook to buy them, and then if they do pass, it really hurts. But I wouldn't put them as more difficult than angelfish. I mean, maybe I'm crazy for saying that, but and it's because for so long they have been bred in these waters and they've adapted to it. And the Germans, in my opinion, did it the best. Which, theirs are the ones that are the most rock solid in the hobby, as far as I'm concerned, and that is because they're bred and raised strictly in tap water. Nothing resembling the Amazon at all. So there's that name again, Amazon. But I think that's what kind of led to discus having the reputation that they did. But that's long gone. I mean, like decades and decades have gone by since that was a real problem. And I mean, that's how we got all the fancy colors and all the patterns and stuff like that. They don't come out of the wild looking like that. That's from generation after generation of breeding, and that whole time they've been adapting to that 7.6 pH and the hardness and all of that. So just changes the game completely.
Yes, it does. Yeah, discus, guppies, some of the mollies, your bettas, all these line bred fish that we see that we enjoy. And I know there's a lot of people, especially with the discus, they enjoy those line bred fish, those colors, more than the wild type. And I'm going to say something that people are like, oh my gosh, can't believe you said that. I do. I like the line bred colors. I think they're just more vibrant, more interesting than, I don't get me wrong. I enjoy the wild type discus colors very much, but I think if I were going to pick discus, if one of these tanks behind me were going to turn into a discus tank, yeah, you'd see the yellow and the red and all these colors that were more line bred than natural. The other thing I think that people are most concerned about, and it's not just the environmental impact. It's just popped into my brain. I can't believe I didn't think about it earlier. It's not just the environmental impact, but it's the amount of loss in the shipping process that occurs from where you are getting the fish to the end user. I mean, compared to tank raised fish, I don't have the numbers, but for just what we do on our side, the closer something is to being taken out of the wild, it's really common to see a lot more loss, even just shipping from a place overseas to the wholesaler or eventually to someone who's a distributor. The loss is significant. It can be.
Yep. Yeah, and my brain, I'll just start calling you John because my brain does the same thing, but I go off into different directions. But this is your topic and I'm just along for the ride. But the last thing that I would want to add is, if you are a fish keeper and you're entertaining the idea of buying wild caught fish, I would ask you to ask yourself a question. And that question is, why? What is the significance behind getting the wild caught fish? Is it because you want to breed them and you want to supply your region with these fish that are very hard to find and you want to make a few dollars? Okay, then I get it. But if your purpose for buying wild caught fish is simply to be able to tell people that come in your house, look at that, that's wild caught, I personally don't think that's the right reason to do it. You gain nothing from that. I mean, it's just a fish that was pulled out of the wild and put into a glass box. So, you might have a lot of people like me that would be like, well, that's not cool. Why are you showing me that? But then there might be others that are, impressed by that kind of thing. If you're doing it because you're not like Jason and you like the fish that have that wild look, me personally, I agree with you 100%. I love a discus tank that's full of all the colors, all of them. The checkerboards I love it. It's amazing. The red melon discus with the red head and the white body, one of the prettiest fish on earth. Love it so much. Lisa is the opposite. Her favorite is the Santarum, a Stenker discus that is specifically bred to appear close to what a wild discus looks like. And she likes that in a darker water tank with the plants and with all of that. And that's a beautiful look too. I feel like the wild look is great in certain circumstances, but if you want that wow factor, to me, with all the colors, it's no different than this tank behind me. It's the fish are the focal point. Yeah. You get the yellows and the silvers and the blues and the whites and the reds. I think that's absolutely
Yeah.
spectacular. So just ask yourself why. Why is it that this wild fish is appealing to you? If you like that look, okay. If you want to breed them, okay. But if it's the novelty behind it, that's a hard pass for me.
Yeah, I'm 100% agree with what you said, and yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up the discussion is analyze what it is you are trying to achieve, and also keep in mind again some of the fish that you have you may not realize it, but they may be wild caught just because there's no other way to obtain those fish. And so if you're somebody who is possibly just ethically and morally against wild caught fish, take a look at your aquariums. What kind of plecos do you have? What kind of loaches are you keeping right now? What kind of schooling fish are you keeping? Do a little bit of research. See, okay, are these fish easy to breed in captivity? Because if they're not, or you can't find breeding information about some of the fish you're keeping at all, chances are the reason is because they don't breed well in captivity and they are just catching them from the wild. And so that's a decision that you would want to make as you're looking at how you're stocking out your aquariums. Oh, yeah, I really like this particular type of loach. I really like this particular type of goby. Turns out nobody's figured out how to breed this particular fish in captivity. Therefore, they must be coming from the wild. So maybe I will pick a different fish. So just be aware that just because you haven't made the conscious decision to go to that fish, I'm like, oh, here's wild caught. I'm going to buy these. Rummy nose tetras are a great example of that. A lot of the rummy nose tetras that come in are wild caught. That's why when you go to a pet store, when you look online, a lot of retailers will make the distinction. Here's rummy nose tetras. Here's tank raised rummy nose. And in fact, that's the opposite. Usually the tank raised rummy nose are more expensive than the wild caught because they can just scoop out those tetras by the thousands. And it's really cheap to do, where if you have to tank raise them, you have to breed them in a tank, they can be more expensive. We bring in roseline sharks all the time, and I have the option every time I do that, wild caught or tank raised. I always bring in the tank raised there, obviously, because again, I want to minimize the impact it's having on nature, but also keep in mind with a organization like Project Piaba, who are teaching people how to sustainably manage their aquatic ecosystems, you could actually be providing an advantage. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all bad. And I highly encourage you, go to Project Piaba. I think it's .org. Go to their website, see what they're doing. There are other organizations. They're not the only one. What's the other one that works with saltwater? Because we really didn't even get into that because we're primarily freshwater. Do you remember?
There's so many. The one, it was like 10,000 mermaids or something
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
that.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I knew. Just remember when we were doing early Aquashellas, we had like, there were two people that we were promoting. Project Piaba was one. I think it was the 10,000 Mermaids might have been the other one. They focus on saltwater. Now that's a bigger problem. That's not something we even discuss because we're, like I said, we're primarily a freshwater channel or, podcast. But saltwater is a different story. If you're keeping
Yeah.
saltwater, there's a high likelihood that the vast majority of fish that you have in your tank right now all came straight out of the ocean somewhere, because it's a lot harder to breed saltwater fish because they have a larval form. It's not like these little fry that you feed in freshwater, like, oh, I'll just crush up some flake food and I'll put some live baby brine. The larval forms of some of these saltwater fish, they eat things that we just cannot mimic in an aquarium. So keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, with my limited knowledge of saltwater, I mean, I do have a tank and I love it. It's amazing. But I think clowns are very much bred in captivity. Not all of them that you see in the industry are bred in captivity, but that's one that they figured out. I think maybe damsels, chromis. There's a few,
Yeah.
and I could be wrong on the other two, but I
Seahorses
know.
would be another one.
Yeah, absolutely. There are stuff that they are breeding, but it's true. In fact, I did a debate with Jake Adams, another Adams, not related to you, that was on the stage at Aquashella. That was saltwater versus freshwater, and that was one of the points that I brought up, kind of against saltwater, even though I love saltwater fish, was the fact that you have that ethical thing in your brain. Do you like fish? Did you see Finding Nemo? Do you like that the fish is being pulled from its family and all of that and being brought into your glass box? And just like what happened last week in the Amazon debate, Jake absolutely wiped the floor with me on that and had a good rebuttal to that. I guess I'm just not a debater. I should just stay away from
You
that.
do
But
just fine. Don't sell yourself short there.
but well, yeah, but that was that was one of the things, with saltwater. If what we've been talking about today bothers you, the idea of removing a fish from its natural environment and bringing it in and putting it in a glass box, if that bothers you, you might want to stay away from saltwater, because it's kind of hard unless you're going to keep clowns, and then you have to research, is the place that you're buying clowns, are they breeding them? You'll be hard pressed to find fish that are not pulled from the wild, and that's a problem for a lot of people. And I'm a hypocrite, because I have a saltwater tank that's got 4 or 5 fish in it that are probably from the wild. So, there's no other way of doing it if you're going to do saltwater. So I
guess the
have a question.
plus size on that, though, is a lot of the saltwater fish live a lot longer than many of the freshwater fish do. Like some of those fish you have in that tank, you might have them for 20, 25 years. I was just talking to somebody at Aquashella. They had a saltwater tank, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've had this fish for 30 years, this one for 20. And it's fairly rare. Like oldest fish I've got in my fish right now is a Raphael cat. The thing is, what is this, 2024? I think it's 16, 17 years old. They can live to be about 30. But maybe even longer. But most freshwater fish, you're hard pressed to get them past 10, 15 years. I mean, I understand there are fish that live longer, but in an aquarium, things tend to happen. Oh, my heater blew out. Oh, this happened. Oh, the fish jumped. Oh, there was a catastrophe. But a lot of times you're hitting that 10, 12, 15-year mark. You're like, wow, that's pretty good. That is far more common, even with some of the smaller saltwater fish.
Yeah. Koi are another one that you can have for quite some time.
You might have to will those down to somebody,
Yeah.
Kids, you're going to take care of Barney, right? Yeah, Dad, we'll take care of Barney.
They're
all
like
right,
tortoises.
Here's my tortoise, too. You're going to have to give that to our great-grandchildren. So,
yeah. We were at a store the other day, and Lisa was looking at a tortoise, and she was like a 9-year-old. She was like, please, please, please. I'm like, come on. Who's going to take care of this thing when it outlives us by 40 years?
But you've got the land for it. I mean, we had a tortoise. I don't know if you know that, but a long time ago, we got a little baby tortoise that we got at a swap. I was not part of this decision. It was Luke who's like, oh, I want a tortoise. Oh, it's close to his birthday. Joanne and him show up with this little tortoise. It was one of the smaller varieties. I'm like, what is that? I'm like, did you seriously just buy a tortoise? They're like, yeah. I'm like, where are we we live in a townhome. What are we going to do with this thing? Oh, we'll build a pen in the garage for it. I'm like, this thing is going to outlive all of us. And so eventually it got bigger. My father-in-law, who was older, and he didn't really have a lot going on at the time, he was living by himself. We're like, all right, her name was Tina. I'm like, you take care of Tina. And so he took care of her for a while. And eventually we talked to the guy who bred him. Like, hey, man, they made a mistake. We did the ultimate thing that we tell people not to do with fish. I'm like, dude, they made a mistake. They got this tortoise. Now it's the size of like a volleyball. I'm like, do you want it back? He's like, oh, yeah, because females, I guess, are somewhat unusual. They're harder to come by. He's like, oh, it's a female. Yeah, give me that back because I can breed them. I'm like, here, Tina's back. And Tina is living a great life. But Tina's got a big field, a fenced-in thing where the fence is like dug into the ground so they can't get out. They have a barn shelter. So anyway, I don't know why we're talking about tortoises, but
I do have the space for it, and the environment here is close. I mean, it's not perfect like Arizona would be, but I'm afraid she might win that argument one of these days, and she might give me those puppy dog eyes, and I might cave to her. And
why don't you just give her a baby goat? I mean, when I have a place that's, by the way, when we were in Tennessee, we were looking at places that aren't terribly far away. So, or at least I was. Joanna wasn't there, but
nice.
Baby goats, man, that's going to happen. That's going to be a thing.
Well, it was supposed to start with chickens, which we haven't done yet. We both want chickens. I would love an unlimited supply of eggs. That would be amazing. And then maybe graduate to goats. My nephew has goats. He's actually bred the mini goats before. So, we'll see what happens there. But we've been talking about it for years now, and it hasn't happened. But I got a question for you. Yeah. And it kind of goes along the lines of what we're talking about here. Before we started recording today, you and I discussed the potential of doing a new segment in the podcast. We're at 54 minutes, so we've got a little bit of time. I was wondering if you wanted to give it a shot on this one, on this episode. Something that we used to do way back in the day. The podcast used to be me and Lisa, and then it went to just me. we used to do a segment called John's World or Jason. Not it wasn't Jason's then, or
You were
Lisa's
talking
World.
about me behind my back years ago.
Yeah, 5 years before I even knew you.
Yeah,
But the segment would be basically an opportunity for us to discuss something that has nothing to do with fish keeping. It's something that's going on in our world. It was a segment that people tended to enjoy back in the day. I don't know if people want that, because we kind of start these episodes, we get right into it, and we go for it. Sometimes people don't want to know anything about us, but maybe give it a shot. I've got something I could certainly talk about today. I don't know if
sure.
you had one, but let's go for it on this episode. Maybe do a Jason's World and a John's World.
Absolutely. We could certainly do that. If, again, leave in the comment section below. Is it something you want to hear? Like, dude, just stick to the fish, man. I'm out. And
We'll
that's
always
fine.
do it at the end. We'll always do
You
it
can
at the
just
end.
click off right now. Done. I'm good. My world, what's been going on? Well, it's been busy because we had Aquashella, and then Joanna and I were supposed to leave for the Smoky Mountains. We'd take our motorcycles. We each have a Harley Davidson. We were hopping on the bikes with a couple buddies, headed down to the Smoky Mountains, Gatlinburg area. That's why I just mentioned that we were kind of down in your neck of the woods. And interestingly enough, the night that we're supposed to leave, so we're basically packed up, ready to go. Our plan is to leave at 5 a.m. to get out of the Chicagoland area. We're going to take all side roads down to Kentucky, stay there overnight, go from Kentucky, all side roads, middle of the nowhere, down to Gatlinburg the next day. 2 o'clock in the morning, I hear something that sounds like a mule dying in the downstairs area. I'm like, what
no.
the heck? So I stagger around. I look down from the upstairs, and there's Eli, our youngest son, and he hasn't had stomach issues, let's say, since he was a little kid. So 2:30 in the morning, he's like, I can't talk about this with you. I just remembered that.
No, that's
So
fine.
anyway,
It's fine.
No,
It's fine. Go
you're
ahead.
going to be all messed up the rest
No,
of the day.
a story is fine. It's when it happens in front of me that's when it's a problem.
Okay. As I'm telling the story, I'm like, wait a minute. John doesn't like
I appreciate the
stomach
respect, but
issues.
it's fine.
I just realized it. I'm like, wait a minute. So he had stomach issues. I'm not going to go into details. Joanna realized it, and he had stomach issues all night. And Joanna's like, I don't think we're both going to be able to go. I'm like, no, someone's got to stay home. She's like, well, it's you and your two buddies. She was just going to be the fourth bike. She's like, I'll stay home with him. So she didn't get to go. But anyway, so me and my couple buddies, we went down to Gatlinburg on the motorcycles, and it's absolutely beautiful down there. So I'm Chicagoland. This is what I know. I've been born and raised here, other than a couple years in Indianapolis. The mountains, the area, the land, I can pretty much guarantee, and Joanna's on board with this, I've got about 9 years left at my school before I can, go ahead and start thinking about other things. We rode Tennessee, we rode Virginia, we were in, obviously, Kentucky, Indiana, but Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Virginia, all just beautiful around the mountains. So, yeah, we're going back there next year, Joanna and I, because she missed the trip. And we might take our buddies with us, but there's going to be a little bit more research being done in terms of where some nice places to start thinking about.
Well, I know a nice place in Northeast North Carolina. These people have extra bedrooms. I'm just saying,
Nice.
if you want to go another 8 hours towards the coast, I know some people that could take care of you.
Well,
Is your son, is he okay now? Is everything
he's
good?
fine. He was fine by the morning. The problem was he was going to be home. So he had planned, he's like, and he's got his license now. So he's like, I was going to go to the movies. Like he was really looking forward to him, and his older brother, who's basically 20 years old now. They were just going to kind of chill out and have just, time on their own. And so by the morning he was feeling better. He's like, no, Mom, you can go. Really, I'll be fine. I'm like, no, because we don't know what was causing your sickness, and we don't want to be in a different state on motorcycles. And then all of a sudden you call us and be like, hey, yeah, I'm feeling bad again. So
Yeah,
he's fine now.
good. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. I have an interesting story, and it's a story. My John's World story for this week is one that I did not think I was going to be able to tell, but I have to fully admit I was wrong here. I, like you, something that you and I share in common is our love for baseball, and I am a Washington Nationals fan ever since the Nationals changed from the Montreal Expos to the Washington Nationals. I've been a fan of that team. Before then, I would see the Braves on TV every once in a while because they're national and what are the Yankees doing, but I wasn't really a follower of baseball until now. And one of the things that Lisa and I and my whole family used to do 20 times a year before we moved to North Carolina was we would go to Washington Nationals games. It was so much fun to do. And Lisa and I had a trip last weekend, which I'll be talking about in the fish keeping news next week. The Fins and Fury event we went to in Long Island, New York. And Lisa had mentioned before the trip, she said, let's relax on this trip. Let's not make be in a hurry the whole time. Let's do most of the drive on Thursday and finish the rest of the drive up on Friday. Why don't you pick somewhere that's like 6.5, 7 hours from us? We'll stop there, stay the night, and then do the rest of the drive to Long Island the next day. I said, okay, fine. Well, when I looked at the map, that perfect place was Philadelphia. And I said, if we leave mid-morning, we'd be in Philadelphia late afternoon. Let me just see who the Phillies are playing. And wouldn't you know it, the Phillies were playing the Washington Nationals that night. I said, well, forget about it. I have to buy tickets. And I bought tickets on the third base line. And I got to admit, I was a little nervous because let's be real with each other here. Philadelphia has a reputation. At least it does here. I mean, all of the teams that I'm a fan of, the Philadelphia team is in the division, whether it's the Capitals, the Nationals, anyway, it doesn't matter. The Redskins, the Commanders, have the Eagles. The Caps don't have the Flyers. Anyway, who cares? The Nationals are in the division with the Phillies, so they play them 19 times a year. And so I'm like, well, let's go there. And all of the games I've been to in the past have always been in the Washington, whether it be for the Redskins, now Commanders, Philadelphia 76ers, all of them. I've never been to an away game. And I never had any interest in going to an away game because of the reputation of Philadelphia fans not being the most pleasant people. Their football stadium has a jail in it. I mean, so I was a little bit nervous. And it wasn't helped by the fact that Lisa and I are Nationals fans, and we were not going to keep that a secret from anybody. We were going to go there wearing our jerseys. I've got 4 or 5 Nationals jerseys, and I decided to pick one that I thought might go over the best with the fans there in Philadelphia, and that would be a jersey for my favorite baseball player of all time, which is Jason Worth. He's a gentleman that played for the Phillies and the Nationals, and so I thought, he was a great player for the Phillies. Maybe they'll go easy on me since I'm, wearing his jersey. We show up there. First of all, Citizens Bank Park is gorgeous. I've never been to an away baseball game. It was gorgeous. And the parking and the getting in and out of it and all of that is absolutely hands down way better than the Nationals. That's just a fact. We haven't been to a game in 2 years since we moved here. So I was super excited. We walk in there. I swear we were the only 2 Washington Nationals fans in the entire stadium. This is a Thursday night. They're playing a team. The Nationals are not very good right now. But the place was still sold out. It was packed. And we were the only 2 Nationals fans in there. But I got to say, this is where I was wrong. My fear of Philadelphia was absolutely wrong. Every single person that we came in contact with was just as pleasant and as nice and as welcoming. Hey, come on in, especially wearing a Jason Worth jersey. You're okay with us. Come on in. My wife, on the other hand, was wearing a Sean Doolittle jersey, who was a relief pitcher for the Nationals. He's retired. He's on the Nationals staff now. Not a controversial player or a hated player in the league. So, nobody gave her a hard time, but just as pleasant and as an enjoyable of an experience as I could have possibly had. Maybe some of that had to do with the fact that the Nationals lost 13-3. The Philadelphia fans were in a good mood that day because of that, but an amazing experience. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It was worth the money. The people were very pleasant. The stadium was gorgeous. Our seats were amazing. I had a foul ball land in the aisle in front of me. No, I didn't go for it because I'm not trying to start a fight in Philadelphia. But it was a great experience, other than the fact that the Nationals got their butt kicked. But great time there. Thank you, Philadelphia, for going easy on us while we were there.
Remind me for next week. I'll have to tell you the Kansas City story that goes along with your Philadelphia story. So
okay, I'm looking forward to that one.
So everybody, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you hanging out with us every single week. If you've got thoughts about wild caught versus tank raised fish, like I keep saying, leave that in the comments section below. As always, we're going to be back same time, same place next week. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.